I am Chloe. I am 32 years old, and for 3 years I played the role of a pathetic freeloader just to protect my husband's fragile ego. I let his family treat me like garbage because I believed keeping the peace was the only way to hold a marriage together. That delusion shattered completely on a Tuesday evening when my husband Julian ordered me to apologize to his mother or pack my bags and get out of his life. I chose to get out. I picked up my terrified 3-year-old son, grabbed the silver keys, and slid into a cherry-red Ferrari. I can still see my mother-in-law sprinting down the driveway screaming at me to leave the car because she thought it belonged to her successful son. She had absolutely no idea that the luxury sports car and the suburban mansion she was standing in front of actually belonged to the woman she had just spent the night calling a worthless gold digger. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your true worth. The evening began like any obligatory family dinner at our estate. We were seated around the grand mahogany table. Julian was at the head of the table wearing his expensive custom suit. He is a senior wealth manager at a major financial firm in Chicago, and he makes sure everyone in the room knows it. His mother Victoria sat to his right, wearing a heavy pearl necklace and a permanent scowl she reserved exclusively for me. His sister Sloane sat across from her, constantly checking her phone and rolling her eyes. I was sitting near the far end of the table trying to feed my 3-year-old son Theo. Theo had accidentally dropped a piece of roasted carrot onto his shirt. He was babbling happily and reaching for another piece of food. Before I could even reach for a napkin, Victoria lunged across the table with startling aggression. She snatched the bib right off Theo's neck with such violent force that her sharp manicured fingernails scratched his delicate skin. Theo immediately began to cry loudly, reaching out for me in absolute confusion and pain. I instantly pulled him tightly into my lap and rubbed his back to soothe him. Victoria threw the slightly stained bib onto the polished wood table with a heavy sigh of absolute disgust. She looked at me with piercing, hateful eyes. She told me I was raising my son to be a complete slob. She said it was honestly embarrassing to watch. She raised her voice so her son could hear every single word. "You stay home all day doing absolutely nothing, and you still cannot manage to teach your own child basic table manners." I took a slow, deep breath, trying to control the massive spike of anger burning in my chest. I wiped my son's face with a soft cloth. I told Victoria that he is only 3 years old, and dropping a piece of food is entirely normal. I clearly stated there was absolutely no need to snatch things from his neck and physically hurt him. Victoria scoffed loudly and rolled her eyes toward the vaulted ceiling. She said making a mess was normal for me, perhaps because I grew up with nothing. She boasted that Julian was never allowed to make such a mess because she actually put effort into raising her children. She looked me up and down with pure contempt. She said I did not do any real work. She claimed I just sat around the house in cheap sweatpants pretending to be a freelance graphic designer while typing aimlessly on a laptop. She took a deliberate sip of her expensive red wine and looked affectionately at Julian. She loudly praised her son for breaking his back working 60-hour weeks just to provide this lavish lifestyle for a freeloader like me. She said the absolute least I could do was make sure his son did not look like a street urchin at the dinner table. Sloane immediately chimed in to support her mother. Sloane had not held a steady job in 5 years and secretly relied on the money Julian funneled to her every single month. She leaned forward with a nasty smirk and told me I was incredibly ungrateful. She said I should be kissing the ground her brother walks on instead of talking back to their mother. As they hurled these vicious insults at me, my mind flashed to the actual reality of our financial situation. They viewed me as a charity case who managed to trap a wealthy provider. They had absolutely no idea that I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of a massive financial technology venture capital firm worth tens of millions of dollars. I spent years building my massive corporate empire quietly from home. To avoid triggering Julian's incredibly fragile ego, I kept my massive achievements entirely private. I let him believe my income was just a tiny fraction of his salary. That decision to shrink myself to protect his pride paved the way for the most degrading night of my entire life. I looked at Julian, expecting him to intervene and defend his wife and his child. He knew I contributed to our household, but he did not look up. He just kept cutting his expensive steak and chewing his food, as if his mother was not actively degrading the mother of his child in their own dining room. The heavy silence from his end of the grand table was absolutely deafening. I tightened my hold on Theo, who was resting his wet cheek against my shoulder. I looked directly at Victoria and spoke with a low, steady voice so I would not frighten my son again. I told her I contribute equally to this household. I stated firmly that my work is valid, and I will not sit here and let anyone speak to me with such hostility in my own home, especially not in front of my child. The moment those words left my mouth, the fragile atmosphere in the dining room shattered completely. Victoria let out a dramatic gasp and pressed her hand to her pearls as if I had just struck her across the face. Sloane dropped her fork in outrage and looked at her brother for defense. But it was Julian's reaction that truly shifted the ground beneath my feet. He dropped his heavy silver cutlery onto his ceramic plate with a loud clatter that made my son jump in my arms. He placed both of his hands flat on the wood table and slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He stood to his full imposing height. The entire room went dead silent. He turned his head incredibly slowly and locked his cold, dark eyes onto mine. His face was flushed red with a furious glare that told me the final thread of our marriage was about to snap. He walked around the large table slowly. His heavy footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor. He breathed heavily with his chest rising and falling beneath his tailored designer shirt. He stared at me as if he was looking at an insect that had just crawled across his pristine dining table. I simply refused to shrink away. I forced my breathing to remain steady. I held Theo closer to my chest and looked up at my arrogant husband with a calm clarity I did not know I possessed. Victoria watched with a triumphant gleam in her eyes. She was clearly thrilled that her successful son was finally putting me in my place. Julian leaned down and placed one hand on the back of my chair and the other on the table, effectively trapping me. He thought he had me completely cornered. His breath smelled of expensive wine and cold, bitter anger. He spoke in a low, terrifying whisper meant to humiliate me completely. He told me I had exactly one choice. He ordered me to apologize to his mother right now or pack my things and get out of his life. He told me that failures do not dictate the rules in his house. The cruelty of his words hung heavily in the tense air. I looked from him to Victoria, who was practically glowing with immense satisfaction. I did not move. I did not speak. I just stared at the man I had married, wondering when he had turned into a complete stranger. My absolute silence seemed to infuriate him even more. He grabbed his half-full glass of red wine from the table. Without any warning, he forcefully threw the dark liquid directly at me. The red wine splashed across my chest, soaking immediately into the light fabric of my favorite blouse. Drops of the cold liquid splattered onto my young son, causing him to whimper and bury his face deep into my neck. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat there feeling the cold liquid seep through my shirt. Julian stood over me, expecting me to crumble. He fully expected me to beg for his forgiveness. He expected me to cry and promise to be a better and more compliant wife. He wanted total submission. Instead, I slowly stood up. I held Theo securely on my left hip, making sure his face was turned away from the sheer hostility in the room. I looked Julian squarely in the eyes. I told him, "Fine, I will go." The absolute lack of emotion in my steady voice caught him completely off guard. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. I turned my back on him. I did not look at Victoria or Sloane. I simply walked out of the formal dining room. I did not go upstairs to pack a bag. I did not need anything from that toxic house. My real life, my real assets, and my real absolute power were completely detached from this horrible environment. I walked down the grand hallway with my heels clicking firmly against the imported marble floor. I stopped at the entryway console table. A silver keyring sat perfectly centered on a decorative tray. I scooped up the keys and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The cool night air hit my face, feeling incredibly refreshing after the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. I walked briskly down the front steps and approached the wide paved driveway. Sitting there gleaming under the bright outdoor security lights was the cherry-red Ferrari that Julian loved more than anything else in the entire world. He treated that luxury car like it was his greatest personal achievement. I opened the passenger door and carefully strapped Theo into his secure car seat. I grabbed a clean, soft blanket from the back to wipe the few drops of wine off his little arm. Then I walked around to the driver's seat and slid inside. The rich leather interior smelled familiar and comforting. I pushed the ignition button, and the massive, powerful engine roared to life, shattering the quiet peace of the upscale suburban neighborhood. The loud roar of the engine must have shaken them out of their stunned silence inside the house. The heavy front door flew open and banged loudly against the exterior brick wall. Victoria came sprinting out onto the front porch. Her expensive heels clicked frantically as she scrambled down the brick steps. She waved her arms wildly in the air with her face twisted in absolute panic. Julian and Sloane appeared in the doorway right behind her, looking completely bewildered. Victoria ran down the long paved driveway, shouting at the top of her lungs. Her voice cut through the cool night air, sounding shrill and incredibly desperate. She screamed at me to leave the car alone. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She ordered me to get out of the car right now, claiming it was her son's vehicle, and I had no right to take his valuable property. I shifted the car into gear and let it inch forward just a little bit. I rolled down the window, letting the crisp evening breeze blow through my hair. Victoria reached the edge of the driveway. She was panting heavily and glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She firmly believed this beautiful, powerful machine and the massive million-dollar house behind her belonged entirely to the man she had raised. She truly thought I was just a penniless housewife trying to steal from her wealthy son. I looked at her red, angry face and simply smirked. I did not offer her a single explanation. I did not tell her that the Ferrari was purchased entirely by my company, and Julian was only an authorized driver on my corporate account. I did not mention that the massive estate was fully owned by my private trust. I just smiled, rolled the tinted window back up, and pressed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. The wide tires gripped the pavement, and I accelerated smoothly into the dark night. I left them standing in the driveway, choking on the heavy exhaust. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully kicked a useless freeloader to the curb. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them when the sun came up. I spent the night in a luxurious downtown hotel suite with my son safely asleep beside me. I was wide awake, setting the final pieces of my carefully crafted plan into motion. I knew Julian would wake up feeling utterly invincible. I knew he would twist the narrative to favor his massive ego. He genuinely believed I was completely dependent on him for my very survival. Sure enough, a new message from Julian illuminated my phone screen the next morning. He did not ask if his 3-year-old son was safe. He sent a threatening text telling me he would cut off my credit cards and leave me with absolutely nothing if I did not crawl back and apologize. I read the pathetic message twice. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I simply took a screenshot and forwarded it directly to my ruthless legal team. Miles away, Julian was sitting at his kitchen island drinking espresso and basking in his perceived victory. His arrogant celebration was about to be cut violently short. At precisely 9 a.m, his cell phone began to ring loudly. It was not me calling to beg for his money. It was my lawyer calling to completely destroy his entire fabricated reality. The heavy silence from his end of the grand mahogany table was absolutely deafening. I looked at Julian, fully expecting him to intervene and defend his wife and his young child. He knew exactly how hard I worked. He knew I contributed to our household expenses, but he did not even look up from his plate. He just kept cutting his expensive steak and chewing his food as if his mother was not actively degrading the mother of his child in their very own dining room. I tightened my hold on Theo, who had finally stopped crying and was resting his wet cheek against my shoulder. I looked directly at Victoria and spoke with a low, steady voice so I would not frighten my son again. I told her I contribute equally to this household. I stated firmly that my work is valid, and I will not sit here and let anyone speak to me with such hostility in my own home, especially not in front of my child. The moment those words left my mouth, the fragile atmosphere in the dining room shattered completely. Victoria let out a dramatic gasp and pressed her manicured hand to her heavy pearl necklace, as if I had just physically struck her across the face. Sloane slammed her silver fork down onto her ceramic plate, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the large room. "Your own home," she mocked, leaning forward with a nasty smirk painting her face. "Please, Chloe, we all know Julian pays the mortgage on this massive place. Your little freelance graphic design gigs probably do not even cover the monthly property taxes. You are so incredibly ungrateful. My brother gives you a beautiful life other women only dream about." The absolute audacity of her words made my blood boil. My sister-in-law Sloane had not held a steady job in 5 entire years. She relied entirely on the money Julian secretly funneled to her every single month. Money that ultimately came from the joint checking account I regularly replenished with my corporate business dividends. They sat there draped in expensive jewelry and designer clothes, judging my worth based on a fabricated reality they had completely bought into. I looked directly into Sloane's eyes, refusing to back down. I told her she had absolutely no idea how this household functions financially. I turned back to my mother-in-law and told her she had no right to discipline my son or insult my parenting. I calmly stated that if they could not speak to me with basic human respect, they could leave this table right now. That was the exact moment Julian finally reacted. It was the reaction that truly shifted the ground beneath my feet and sealed his fate forever. He dropped his heavy silver cutlery onto his plate with a loud, aggressive clatter that made Theo jump in my arms. He grabbed his half-full crystal glass of expensive red wine from the table. Without a single second of warning, he forcefully threw the dark red liquid directly across the table at me. The cold red wine splashed violently across my chest, soaking immediately into the light fabric of my favorite silk blouse. Drops of it splattered onto Theo, causing my young son to whimper and bury his face deep into my neck. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat there feeling the cold liquid seep through my shirt as the absolute cruelty of his action hung heavily in the air. Julian placed both of his hands flat on the polished wood and slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He stood to his full, imposing height, towering over the table. The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the beating of my own heart. He turned his head incredibly slowly and locked his cold, dark eyes onto mine. His face was flushed a dark, angry red with a furious glare that told me the final thread of our marriage was completely snapped. He breathed heavily with his chest rising and falling beneath his tailored designer suit. He walked around the large table slowly. His heavy footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor. I simply refused to shrink away. I forced my breathing to remain steady. I held Theo closer to my chest and looked up at my arrogant husband with a calm clarity I did not know I possessed. Victoria watched with a triumphant gleam in her eyes, clearly thrilled that her successful son was finally putting me in my place. Sloane leaned forward eagerly, resting her chin on her hands, ready for the show. Julian leaned down and placed one hand on the back of my chair and the other on the table, effectively trapping me. He thought he had me completely cornered. He felt incredibly powerful. His breath smelled of alcohol and cold, bitter anger. He spoke in a low, terrifying whisper meant to humiliate me completely. "You have exactly one choice, Chloe. Either you apologize to my mother right now, or you pack your things and get out of my life. Failures do not dictate the rules in my house." The sheer delusion of his ultimatum was staggering. He was a senior wealth manager who cared only about status, and he genuinely believed I was completely dependent on him for my very survival. He looked down at me, expecting me to crumble under his authority. He fully expected me to beg for his forgiveness. He wanted me to cry and promise to be a better, more compliant wife. He wanted total submission. I looked from him to Victoria, who was practically glowing with immense satisfaction. I did not move. I did not speak. I just stared at the man I had married, realizing he was nothing more than a pathetic bully. My silence seemed to infuriate him even more. He slammed his fist down on the table and yelled at me to answer him. He had absolutely no idea that his demand for an apology was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. It was the exact push I needed to finally stop protecting his fragile ego. I was done shrinking myself. I was done hiding my massive corporate empire to make him feel like a real man. The time for keeping the peace was officially over. Julian stood over me with his chest heaving as he fully expected a complete emotional breakdown. He waited eagerly for the tears to fall. He waited for the frantic apologies and the desperate pleading of a dependent wife, terrified of losing her wealthy provider. But I did not give him a single tear. My absolute silence seemed to completely unnerve him. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as he searched my eyes for fear and found absolutely none. I looked down at the dark red wine dripping from my ruined silk blouse. Then I looked at my terrified young son clutching my neck. Finally, I looked directly into Julian's cold eyes. He was a small, pathetic man who needed to degrade a woman just to feel powerful. I slowly stood up, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape against the hardwood floor. I kept Theo securely on my left hip to shield him from the intense hostility radiating from his father. I kept my voice completely level and completely devoid of any emotion. I looked my husband squarely in the face and said, "Fine, I will go." Julian blinked rapidly, momentarily stunned by my immediate compliance without a single fight. He opened his mouth to say something else, perhaps, to assert more dominance and demand that I leave Theo behind. But I did not give him the chance to speak. I turned my back on him without another word. I did not look at Victoria, who was still clutching her heavy pearl necklace, or Sloane, who was staring at me with her jaw dropped in absolute shock. I simply walked out of the grand dining room. I did not run upstairs to pack a suitcase. I did not grab my laptop or beg for time to gather my personal belongings. I did not need a single thing from that toxic house. My real assets, my massive corporate fortune, and my absolute power were completely detached from their fabricated reality. I walked down the long hallway with my heels clicking firmly against the imported marble floor, echoing the absolute finality of my decision. I stopped at the entryway console table. Resting perfectly centered on a silver decorative tray was a set of heavy car keys. I scooped the keys into my free hand and pushed open the massive oak front door. The cool night air hit my face, feeling incredibly refreshing after the suffocating and highly toxic atmosphere of that dining room. I walked briskly down the brick front steps and approached the wide paved driveway. Sitting there gleaming beautifully under the bright outdoor security lights was the cherry-red Ferrari that Julian loved more than his own family. He treated that luxury sports car like it was his greatest personal achievement and a shining symbol of his executive status. I opened the passenger door and carefully strapped Theo into his secure car seat. I grabbed a clean, soft blanket from the back seat to gently wipe the remaining drops of cold wine off his little arm, making sure he felt safe and calm. Then I walked around to the driver's seat and slid inside. The rich leather interior smelled familiar and expensive. I pushed the ignition button, and the massive, powerful engine roared to life, instantly shattering the quiet peace of the upscale suburban neighborhood. The loud, aggressive roar of the engine must have violently shaken them out of their stunned silence inside the house. The heavy front door flew open and banged loudly against the exterior brick wall. Victoria came sprinting out onto the front porch. Her expensive heels clicked frantically as she scrambled clumsily down the steps. She waved her arms wildly in the air, with her face twisted in absolute panic. Julian and Sloane appeared in the doorway right behind her, looking completely bewildered. Victoria ran down the long paved driveway, shouting at the top of her lungs. Her voice cut through the cool night air, sounding shrill and incredibly desperate. She screamed at me to turn the engine off right now. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She ordered me to get out of that car immediately, screaming that it was her son's vehicle and I had absolutely no right to touch his valuable property. I shifted the car into gear and let it inch forward just a little bit, forcing her to step back from the bumper. I rolled down the tinted window, letting the crisp evening breeze blow through my hair. Victoria reached the edge of my window, panting heavily and glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She firmly believed this beautiful machine and the massive $1-million house behind her belonged entirely to the man she had raised. She truly thought I was just a penniless, useless housewife trying to steal a joyride from her wealthy son. I looked at her red, angry face and simply smirked. I did not offer her a single explanation. I did not tell her that the Ferrari was purchased entirely by my corporate leasing company, and Julian was nothing more than an authorized driver on my business account. I did not mention that the massive estate she was standing in was fully owned by my private trust. I just smiled at her, rolled the window back up to silence her frantic screaming, and pressed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. The wide tires gripped the pavement tightly, and I accelerated smoothly into the dark night. I left them standing in the driveway, coughing on the heavy exhaust. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. They thought they had successfully kicked a useless freeloader to the curb and established their absolute dominance over my life. They went to sleep that night feeling utterly invincible and completely unaware that they had just initiated their own total financial ruin. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them when the sun came up and my ruthless legal team finally made that phone call. I knew exactly what Julian was doing that night. He was sitting in his grand living room smirking at his phone. He typed out a pathetic, threatening text message telling me he was going to cut off all my credit cards and leave me with absolutely nothing if I did not crawl back and apologize. He hit send and went to sleep feeling like an absolute king. He genuinely believed I was sitting in a cheap motel somewhere crying my eyes out and terrified of losing his financial support. But when the sun came up the next morning, his phone began to ring loudly across the kitchen counter. He picked it up with a smug smile, fully expecting to hear my desperate voice begging for his forgiveness and a second chance. But it was not me calling. The caller ID displayed the name of the most ruthless and prestigious real estate law firm in Chicago. And the senior partner on the other end of the line was not calling to negotiate a marital dispute. I was calling to completely annihilate Julian's arrogant illusion. Julian answered his cell phone with a crisp, professional tone, fully expecting to hear the voice of a wealthy client, or perhaps my tearful apologies, relayed through a desperate mediator. He puffed out his chest, standing in the grand kitchen, while his mother and sister watched him with absolute admiration. Instead, he found himself speaking to a senior partner at a highly prestigious downtown real estate law firm. I had retained this firm months ago to quietly manage my vast corporate and personal real estate portfolio. The lawyer spoke with a deep, authoritative voice that was smooth and completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Good morning, Julian," the lawyer said sharply. "I am calling to officially inform you that the property management company overseeing your current residence is terminating your month-to-month residential lease agreement, effective immediately. You will be receiving the formal legal documents via certified courier within the hour. You have exactly 30 days to remove all your personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely." Julian stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the expensive kitchen tiles. Victoria and Sloane stopped their triumphant conversation instantly and stared at him in sheer confusion. "What on earth are you talking about?" Julian demanded. His voice echoed angrily off the high ceilings as the first wave of panic hit him. "What lease agreement are you referring to? I am the man of this house. I pay the bills here. You cannot evict me from my own home. This has to be some kind of ridiculous administrative mistake." "There is absolutely no mistake," the lawyer replied calmly, reading directly from the ironclad legal documents I had provided him. "You are currently listed as an authorized tenant on a standard month-to-month residential rental agreement with a private limited liability company. That company has decided to liquidate its assets and terminate all current residential leases. You have 30 days to vacate. If you fail to comply, law enforcement will be brought in to physically escort you off the property." Julian gripped the granite countertop so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He was breathing heavily as his arrogant mind struggled to comprehend how his perfect kingdom was violently crumbling beneath his feet. "This is insane," he yelled, pacing back and forth across the massive kitchen. "I pay the mortgage on this estate. I transfer $7,000 every single month to the property management portal. I demand to speak to the owner of this management company right now to clear this up before I sue your entire firm." The lawyer offered a cold, unsympathetic laugh that echoed through the phone speaker and sent a chill down Julian's spine. "You do not pay a mortgage, Julian. The estate was purchased entirely in cash 3 years ago. The $7,000 you transfer every month is just rent. You signed a standard lease agreement when you moved in. You own absolutely no equity in the property. And as for speaking to the owner, you already know her intimately. The sole beneficiary of the property trust and the chief executive officer of the limited liability company is your wife, Chloe." The expensive smartphone nearly slipped from Julian's sweating hand. He stared blindly at the pristine kitchen island, completely unable to process the impossible words echoing through the receiver. His extravagant lifestyle had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, completely funded by the woman he had consistently degraded. The enormous house he used to impress his corporate clients was not his. He was nothing more than a temporary tenant living inside a rental property that his brilliant wife had allowed him to inhabit. The suffocating panic squeezed his throat as he realized he had absolutely no physical assets tied to his name. He owned nothing. Before Julian could even form a coherent sentence to argue back, a loud, heavy rumbling sound echoed from the front yard. He froze and looked out the large bay window. A massive industrial tow truck was backing slowly into the wide paved driveway with its yellow warning lights flashing brightly in the morning sun. Two men in dark uniforms stepped out of the heavy truck and walked directly toward the empty space where the red Ferrari had been parked just hours prior. They were holding clipboards and scanning the area. Julian dropped his phone onto the counter and ran toward the front door, throwing it open and charging outside into the cool morning air. Victoria and Sloane followed close behind him, their faces pale with sudden terror. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Julian screamed at the tow truck drivers. "Get that truck out of my driveway before I call the police." One of the drivers calmly held up his clipboard, entirely unbothered by the screaming man in the expensive suit. "We have a corporate repossession order for a cherry red Ferrari registered to this specific address," the driver stated flatly. "The leasing corporation officially revoked the authorized driver assignment early this morning. We are here to collect the corporate asset." Julian felt the blood drain completely from his face. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. He screamed that the car belonged to him. He boasted that he was a senior wealth manager, and the vehicle was his primary mode of transportation. He demanded they leave immediately. The driver just shrugged and tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Sir, the vehicle is registered to a corporate financial technology firm. Your name was simply listed as a temporary authorized driver on their corporate insurance policy. That authorization was permanently terminated at 6 o'clock this morning. If you try to interfere with this repossession or refuse to surrender the keys, we are legally authorized to report the vehicle as stolen and have you arrested on the spot." Victoria grabbed Julian's arm, demanding to know what was happening. She shrieked at the drivers, calling them thieves and demanding they show respect to her wealthy son. But Julian could not even look his mother in the eye. The man who had proudly thrown a glass of wine on his wife the night before was now hyperventilating on his own front lawn. He watched helplessly as the tow truck drivers documented the empty parking space and confirmed the vehicle was missing from the premises. The devastating realization that I had already driven the Ferrari to a secure private garage downtown hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He could not call the police. He could not fight the repossession. He had absolutely no legal rights to the luxury car he loved so much. He had lost the multi-million-dollar mansion, and he had lost the exotic sports car in a matter of 5 devastating minutes. His carefully fabricated reality was entirely obliterated. He was standing on a lawn he did not own, realizing that the woman he called a worthless freeloader held his entire existence in the palm of her hand. Julian stormed back into the rental house and screamed for Sloane to get her car keys immediately. Since his precious Ferrari was already gone, he was forced to ride in the passenger seat of his sister's modest sedan. He gripped his leather briefcase so tightly his knuckles ached with the strain. During the agonizingly slow drive downtown, he frantically tried to log into our joint banking application on his phone. The loading screen spun endlessly, feeding his mounting panic. He convinced himself that I had temporarily locked him out as a petty revenge tactic. In his deeply arrogant mind, money was the one weapon I could never take away from him. He genuinely believed that because he held the title of a senior wealth manager, his salary alone was the absolute foundation of our luxurious existence. He planned to march into that bank, empty every single joint checking and savings account, and transfer all the funds into a private account under his name only. He wanted to leave me absolutely destitute. He wanted to force me to crawl back to him begging for grocery money. He spent the entire ride violently plotting my financial ruin, completely blind to the fact that I had already executed his. Sloane pulled up to the curb outside the prestigious downtown branch of our bank. Julian did not even wait for the car to come to a complete stop before he threw the passenger door open and sprinted across the pavement. He burst through the heavy glass doors of the VIP lobby, moving with furious, frantic energy. He completely ignored the line of ordinary customers waiting for tellers and marched directly to the frosted glass office of the branch manager. He pushed the heavy door open without knocking and threw his expensive leather briefcase onto the manager's desk with a loud, aggressive thud. He demanded immediate emergency service, citing a hostile marital dispute. He ordered the manager to instantly freeze all joint assets and transfer the entire available balance into a newly created solo account. He paced back and forth across the plush carpet, boasting loudly about his high net worth and threatening to pull all of his lucrative investments if the bank did not comply with his demands that exact second. The branch manager, a seasoned professional who was entirely unimpressed by Julian's theatrical tantrum, calmly adjusted her glasses. She typed his credentials into her keyboard and pulled up his financial profile on her large monitor. She did not flinch at his loud, arrogant threats. She simply studied the screen for a few tense seconds before looking back up at him with an expression of mild pity. She told him that she would gladly transfer the remaining balance into a solo account for him. Then she slowly turned the monitor around so Julian could see the bright screen for himself. Julian leaned forward eagerly, expecting to see hundreds of thousands of dollars ready to be seized. Instead, he stared at a single pathetic number. The total available balance across all joint checking and savings accounts was exactly $412. Julian froze. The air completely left his lungs. He stared at the 3 digits blinking on the screen and let out a harsh, frantic laugh. He told the manager to refresh the system, claiming the network was clearly experiencing a massive glitch. For years, those accounts had carried enough heavy liquidity to support a massive estate luxury car leases and the secret monthly allowances he funneled to his lazy sister. He shouted that $400 was statistically impossible. The manager did not blink. She calmly stated that the system was perfectly accurate and the balance was correct. Julian's face turned a violent shade of purple. He slammed his fist down on the desk and accused me of committing grand larceny. He screamed that his manipulative wife had illegally drained marital funds in the middle of the night. He demanded the bank immediately reverse every single transfer I had made over the last 24 hours. He threatened to call the police and have me arrested for theft. He leaned over the desk, spitting with rage, as he swore to sue the entire banking institution for participating in domestic financial fraud. The manager waited in absolute silence until Julian completely ran out of breath. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements. She slammed the heavy stack of papers down onto the desk right in front of him. "There was no frantic midnight withdrawal, Julian," she stated coldly. "There was no illegal draining of marital funds. Over the past 48 hours, your wife executed a series of precisely calculated and legally documented transfers. Each withdrawal was accompanied by ironclad financial records identifying the exact source of the money she was removing." Julian grabbed the papers with shaking hands, his eyes darting frantically across the black and white text. The manager explained exactly what he was looking at. She told him that my legal and accounting teams had matched 5 entire years of household records. I had removed only the funds that originated from my own separate corporate dividend deposits, my business reimbursements, and my independent trusts. I had legally reclaimed the massive wealth that belonged exclusively to my financial technology firm. The manager tapped the final page of the statement with her pen, forcing Julian to look at the undeniable truth. She explained that his substantial wealth manager salary was indeed deposited into the joint account every single month. However, his salary was immediately swallowed by his own extravagant spending habits. The statement showed a devastating pattern that Julian had willfully ignored for years. Every time his expensive tailored suits, his lavish client dinners, his golf club memberships, and his secret cash transfers to Sloan outran his income. My corporate money had quietly stabilized the account. The multi-million-dollar lifestyle he aggressively flaunted to his peers was completely subsidized by the woman he constantly degraded. I had left his documented share of the money entirely untouched. The $412 remaining in the account was the exact mathematical sum of what his actual income was worth after his massive vanity expenses were deducted. Julian stared at the transaction lists and felt a cold, sickening dread settle deep into his stomach. The enormous financial imbalance was right there in bold print, making it absolutely impossible to deny. The massive deposits that funded his king-like existence came from entities he had arrogantly ignored because he assumed all incoming money was somehow miraculously tied to his own supposed brilliance. He dropped the papers back onto the desk as if they were physically burning his hands. He asked the manager in a hollow, trembling voice if he could at least place a hard freeze on my corporate credit cards. The manager looked at him with sheer disgust. She informed him that his name was never on the primary accounts. He was merely an authorized user on my corporate expense cards, and I had already revoked his access before he even woke up that morning. The only credit cards left in his name were his personal accounts, which were currently maxed out from his luxury watch purchases. The absolute crushing reality of his situation crashed over him like a suffocating tidal wave. He had spent years treating me like a useless burden while actively taking full credit for everything my hard-earned money purchased. He had paraded around the city acting like a titan of industry, completely oblivious to the fact that he was financially hollow. He was not a wealthy provider. He was the ultimate freeloader. He was a dependent tenant living entirely on his wife's secret charity. And by aggressively throwing that glass of wine and demanding my complete submission, he had forced me to cut the strings that kept his pathetic puppet show running. The humiliation burned his face. He stumbled backward away from the manager's desk, his legs barely able to support his weight. He had marched into the bank expecting to conquer me and leave me ruined. Instead, he was leaving with $400 and the terrifying realization that he could not even afford to hire a lawyer to fight his own eviction. Julian stumbled blindly out of the frosted glass office. His legs felt like heavy lead as he crossed the plush carpet of the bank lobby. He pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the harsh, bright sunlight of downtown Chicago. He was sweating profusely through his expensive custom suit. He raised his hand to shield his eyes from the glare, and the heavy gold watch on his wrist caught the light. He stared at the incredibly expensive Rolex and felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over his entire body. He had purchased that watch just last week to show off to his senior partners at the financial firm. He had arrogantly swiped his personal credit card to pay the massive $15,000 price tag. He had simply assumed that my money sitting in our joint account would effortlessly cover the automatic statement payment at the end of the month, just like it always did. He suddenly realized that his personal credit card was now completely maxed out, and the massive billing cycle was about to hit him like a freight train. He was wearing his own financial ruin right on his wrist. He walked slowly down the concrete ramp into the dim underground parking garage. He found Sloane sitting in her modest sedan near the exit barrier. He opened the passenger door and collapsed heavily into the seat. He did not waste time explaining the humiliating encounter in the bank manager office. He immediately shifted into his aggressive commanding mode because it was the only defense mechanism he had left. He barked an order at his younger sister, telling her he needed to retain a ruthless defense attorney immediately to fight the eviction and force me to hand over his money. He demanded that she open her banking application and wire him $10,000 right that exact second. Sloane did not reach for her phone. She gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned bright white. She stared straight ahead at the parking garage exit barrier and burst into loud, hysterical tears. Julian snapped at her, telling her to stop crying and make the wire transfer. He told her this was a massive family emergency and he needed her compliance. Sloane choked on her heavy sobs and turned to look at her brother with absolute sheer terror in her eyes. She screamed that she could not send him $10,000. She cried that she could not even send him $10. She frantically explained that she had just tried to pay the $15 parking garage exit fee while waiting for him. She said she swiped her primary credit card and the machine aggressively beeped and flashed declined. She panicked and tried 3 other credit cards from her designer wallet. Every single one of them was instantly declined. She told Julian she had logged into her banking application while sitting in the dark car and saw that all her checking balances were deeply in the negative. The automatic draft payments for her luxury downtown apartment rent and her exclusive gym membership had both bounced earlier that morning, triggering massive overdraft fees. Julian felt the blood drain completely from his face. He demanded to know how that was mathematically possible. He shouted that he transfers her a highly generous allowance on the first of every single month to ensure she is perfectly comfortable. He demanded to know where all his money had gone. Sloane shrieked back at him that the allowance was the only thing keeping her afloat because she had not held a paying job in 5 entire years. She sobbed that she spent every last cent he sent her on designer clothes and expensive brunches just to maintain her wealthy socialite image. The devastating truth finally clicked inside Julian's arrogant mind. The money he had been secretly wiring to his sister every month behind my back was not his hard-earned executive salary. He had been transferring my corporate dividends. He had been using my business profits to play the role of the generous, wealthy older brother. The exact moment I legally removed my funds from our joint account, his scheduled automatic transfer to Sloane completely failed. She was instantly cut off from the only financial lifeline she had ever known. She was just as broke and just as financially hollow as he was. The two of them sat in the cheap sedan blocked by the parking garage barrier, completely paralyzed by their sudden poverty. The loud, aggressive honking of the cars waiting in line behind them added to their overwhelming panic. Julian had to frantically dig through the pockets of his tailored suit just to find a crumpled $20 bill to pay the annoyed parking attendant so they could finally escape the underground garage. Julian was sweating profusely. He had no house and no car and no lawyer and absolutely no money. His sister, who had worshipped him as a financial god just hours prior, was staring at him with pure, desperate panic. They were entirely powerless. And because they had absolutely no financial leverage left to use against me, his mother Victoria decided to take matters into her own hands. She decided to use the only dirty tactic they had left and go directly after my 3-year-old son. While Julian and Sloane were suffocating under the crushing weight of their sudden poverty, Victoria was pacing the hardwood floors of the massive rental house. She had tried calling her son a dozen times, but he was entirely unresponsive. She quickly realized that the financial leverage they had always relied on to control me was completely gone. But losing control had always made my mother-in-law incredibly reckless. She convinced herself that if she could not force me to surrender through financial intimidation, she would simply force me to surrender through my child. In her deeply twisted and arrogant mind, she believed she had a natural, undeniable right to take her grandson whenever she wished. She decided she would use my 3-year-old son as the ultimate bargaining chip to force me to cancel the eviction and restore their stolen wealth. Without a single second of hesitation, she grabbed her heavy designer handbag, marched out to her luxury vehicle, and drove aggressively through the suburban streets, heading straight for Theo exclusive private preschool. She fully intended to snatch my young son from his classroom and hold him hostage until I agreed to her insane terms. She thought she was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver. She had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of her, and she was driving straight into her worst nightmare. Victoria drove her luxury sports utility vehicle like an absolute maniac through the quiet streets of the affluent neighborhood. She pulled into the circular driveway of the exclusive private preschool and slammed her car into park directly in a red fire lane. She did not care about the parking rules or the crossing guards. She was a wealthy grandmother on a desperate mission to save her family pride. She grabbed her heavy designer handbag and marched up the paved walkway. Her expensive heels clicked aggressively against the concrete. She pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the preschool, entering the brightly lit reception area with a profound sense of absolute entitlement. The front desk was manned by a polite young receptionist who looked up with a welcoming smile. Victoria did not even bother to offer a basic greeting. She slammed her manicured hands down on the reception desk, leaning forward aggressively. "I am here to pick up my grandson Theo," she demanded in a sharp, commanding tone. "We are having a spontaneous family day, and I need him brought out to the lobby immediately." The receptionist blinked, her smile faltering slightly at the intense hostility radiating from the older woman. She quickly typed Theo's name into the computer system. She politely explained that she did not see Victoria on the authorized pickup list for today. She stated clearly that Chloe had specifically updated the security protocols early this morning, and only the primary custodial parent was permitted to sign the child out of the building under any circumstances. Victoria felt a hot flash of extreme anger burn through her chest. "Do not quote silly administrative rules to me," she snapped, her voice echoing loudly down the quiet, colorful hallway. "I am the child's grandmother, and I have every right to take him whenever I please. His mother is currently going through a severe mental health crisis. Chloe is completely unstable and highly dangerous. I am stepping in to ensure my grandson is properly cared for. You will go to his classroom and bring him to me right now before I call the police and have this entire school investigated for domestic kidnapping." The receptionist looked genuinely alarmed, but she held her ground firmly. She discreetly pressed a silent panic button hidden under her desk. She told Victoria she absolutely could not release a student to anyone who is not explicitly authorized. Victoria completely lost her temper. She began to scream at the young woman, causing a massive, embarrassing scene in the middle of the peaceful lobby. She yelled that I was a delusional, psychotic liar who was trying to destroy a beautiful, wealthy family out of pure spite. Teachers from nearby classrooms began to peek their heads out of their doors, looking highly concerned by the aggressive screaming. Victoria decided she was done talking to the staff. She shoved her way past the reception desk and marched aggressively toward the secure hallway leading to the toddler classrooms. She fully intended to rip the classroom door open and drag Theo out by his little arm to use him as a hostage. She only made it 3 steps down the hall before a massive physical barricade stopped her dead in her tracks. 2 towering, broad-shouldered men dressed in immaculate black suits and wearing discreet earpieces stepped out from an empty administrative office. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They planted their large, muscular frames directly in the middle of the hallway, completely blocking Victoria's path. They crossed their arms and stared down at the frantic older woman with ice-cold professional expressions. Victoria gasped and took a stumbling step backward. She looked up at the intimidating private security contractors, completely bewildered. She demanded to know who they were and ordered them to get out of her way immediately. The men did not speak a single word. They simply parted to the sides, creating a clear path down the center of the hallway. I stepped out from the office and walked slowly toward my mother-in-law. I was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue business suit that radiated pure power and unyielding authority. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was completely unreadable. I had known Victoria would try something incredibly desperate and illegal the moment Julian realized his bank accounts were empty. I had hired the elite security detail before the sun even came up to ensure my son was entirely protected. Victoria stared at me, and her false bravado instantly crumbled under my intense, icy stare. "Chloe, you need to stop this ridiculous game right now," she stammered, attempting to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "You are causing a massive scene and traumatizing my grandson. You need to call off these thugs and come back to the house to act like a normal, respectful wife before my son decides he does not want you anymore." I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in her hysterical screaming match. I simply nodded to a plain-clothed man standing just behind my security guards. The legal process server stepped forward and forcefully pressed a thick, heavy manila envelope against Victoria's chest, forcing her to instinctively grab it to stop it from falling. "You have been officially served," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. Victoria looked down at the heavy envelope in her shaking hands and asked what it was. "It is a legally binding emergency restraining order," I replied calmly. "I presented the family court judge with the threatening text messages your son sent me this morning, along with a sworn affidavit detailing your highly erratic and abusive behavior. The judge granted an immediate protective order. You are now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or my son. If you ever show your face at his school again, my security team will physically detain you, and you will be arrested and thrown in a jail cell on the spot." Victoria opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but the words died completely in her throat. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between us. My security guards tensed, ready to intervene, but I held up a hand. I leaned in very close to Victoria. She smelled of stale, expensive perfume and sheer, utter panic. I lowered my voice to a terrifying whisper meant only for her ears. "Go home, Victoria," I whispered coldly. "You have a much bigger problem waiting for you. I just sent your son-in-law Marcus your entire credit card statement history." Victoria's eyes went wide with pure horror. Marcus is a brilliant orthopedic surgeon and one of the most highly respected African-American men in this entire city. He is a good, honest man who works incredibly hard to provide a beautiful life for your daughter Sloane. And for years you have sat back and watched Sloane financially abuse him. But I just sent him the exact, undeniable proof of where Sloane has been getting her extra money. I sent him the bank records proving she has been secretly draining your retirement funds and using his hard-earned money to fund her sick double life. Check your phone, Victoria, because your entire family is burning to the ground right now. While Victoria was standing paralyzed in the hallway of the preschool, my digital bomb was currently detonating miles away in an upscale gated community. The situation inside Sloane's house was rapidly descending into absolute chaos. Marcus was sitting alone at his kitchen island. He is a brilliant orthopedic surgeon. He is also a proud African-American man who worked incredibly hard to build a highly successful medical career entirely from the ground up. He valued deep integrity and honesty because he had earned every single penny through grueling years of medical school and endless hospital residencies. Over the years, Marcus was the only person in Julian's entire toxic family who had ever treated me with basic human decency and genuine kindness. He always spoke to me with respect at their awful family dinners. Because he was a good, honest man, I decided he absolutely did not deserve to be financially bled dry by a parasitic liar. He had just returned home from a grueling 12-hour surgical shift and opened his personal laptop to check his messages. That is when the high-priority email I sent him popped up on his bright screen. The subject line was simply labeled Financial Audit and Legal Disclosures. Marcus clicked the encrypted link and entered the secure password I had provided in the message. The screen instantly populated with dozens of high-resolution scanned documents, bank statements, and intercepted financial communications. I had utilized my advanced financial technology software to completely map out Sloane's massive web of lies. My corporate data team routinely handles massive data sets, and it took them less than an hour to run a cross-reference algorithm on the family's public social media check-ins versus their hidden bank routing numbers. Marcus began to scroll through the digital folder, and his deep physical exhaustion was instantly replaced by mounting horror. He always thought his wife was just a bit spoiled and relied heavily on a hidden trust fund or her wealthy older brother to constantly buy her new designer clothes. He had absolutely no idea she was a calculated criminal. The first section of the file contained clear, irrefutable proof that Sloane had been secretly draining Victoria's retirement accounts for the past 3 years. The documents showed exactly how Sloane had set up dummy banking accounts online. She had forged her mother's digital signature to funnel thousands of dollars every single month directly into her own private checking account. Every stolen cent was used to finance her raging luxury shopping addiction and maintain her completely fake wealthy socialite image. Marcus stared at the transfer log, sickened by the realization that his wife was methodically robbing her own aging mother blind. He read through the records, showing she had liquidated massive portions of her mother's safe mutual funds just to buy custom handbags and expensive shoes she wore once and threw in the back of her massive closet. But the financial betrayal against Victoria was only the tip of the incredibly toxic iceberg. Marcus kept scrolling down the screen, and his strong hands began to shake with profound fury. The second half of the folder detailed a massive, devastating betrayal against him personally. The digital file contained a huge collection of credit card receipts, airline tickets, and luxury hotel booking confirmations, all tied directly to the joint credit cards Marcus paid off faithfully at the end of every single month. Sloane had always told Marcus she was using those specific cards to make generous anonymous donations to local charities and to attend expensive spiritual wellness retreats to improve her mental health. The data I provided painted a violently different picture. The dates of her supposed peaceful meditation retreats perfectly matched the dates she was actually booking luxury hotel suites downtown with a 22-year-old personal fitness trainer she had met at their exclusive country club. I had cross-referenced the hotel charges with intercepted text messages and social media location tags. The evidence was absolutely airtight and utterly disgusting. Sloane was not meditating or giving back to the community. She was using the massive salary Marcus earned from performing complex surgeries to play the role of a wealthy sugar mama to a young manipulative trainer. The financial trail proved she had purchased the young boy expensive watches, tailored suits, and even financed his luxury sports car lease using Marcus's hard-earned medical salary. Marcus thought about the countless nights he had stayed awake in the emergency room, saving human lives, while his wife was busy sleeping with a boy in hotel rooms he unknowingly paid for. Marcus did not yell. He did not throw things around the kitchen. His brilliant analytical surgeon mind processed the catastrophic betrayal with a terrifying cold precision. He quietly printed the entire stack of damning evidence on his home office printer. He gathered the thick, heavy stack of papers and walked back to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of cold water and waited. 10 minutes later, Sloane walked through the front door. She had just returned from the downtown parking garage after her humiliating realization that her brother was entirely broke. She was busy staring at her phone, whining loudly about her credit cards being mysteriously declined all morning. She dropped her designer purse on the entryway table and walked into the kitchen, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire marriage was about to be permanently obliterated. Marcus looked at her and calmly asked how her morning was going. Sloane sighed dramatically and complained that the bank was making completely ridiculous errors with her accounts. Marcus nodded slowly. He asked her how her recent meditation retreat in Sedona had been. Sloane did not miss a beat. She lied smoothly, claiming the retreat was incredibly peaceful, and she felt so spiritually refreshed. That was the exact moment Marcus threw the heavy pile of printed documents across the expensive granite countertop. Sloane stopped complaining the moment she saw the highlighted bank statements and explicit hotel confirmations scattered across her pristine kitchen island. Her confident, spoiled demeanor evaporated in a single second. All the color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking pale and physically ill. She looked at Marcus and tried to stammer out a pathetic, desperate excuse. She frantically claimed the documents were completely fabricated. She shrieked that I was a malicious, jealous liar who hacked her personal accounts in a desperate attempt to ruin her beautiful life because my own marriage was falling apart. Marcus stood perfectly still. He did not listen to a single one of her frantic, desperate lies. He worked with complex anatomy and precise science every single day, and the financial trail I provided was an undeniable anatomical map of her extreme deceit. He looked at his weeping wife with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He told her she was a hollow, parasitic fraud. He spoke in a low, steady voice, detailing exactly how many hours he spent on his feet in operating rooms, working to build a good life for them, while she was busy stealing from her own mother and betraying him. He told her that her lies were so incredibly pathetic, they were actually insulting to his intelligence. Marcus pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket and immediately called his aggressive divorce attorney. He stood right in front of Sloane and instructed the lawyer to draft the divorce petition, immediately citing severe financial fraud and adultery. He specifically requested that the lawyer freeze all joint assets to ensure she could not steal another single dime. He then ended the call and looked Sloane directly in the eyes. He told her she had exactly 1 hour to pack a single suitcase and get out of his house. He clearly stated that if she was not gone by the time the hour was up, he would call the police and hand over the entire folder of evidence reporting her for grand larceny, identity theft, and massive credit card fraud. Sloane dropped to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor. She began sobbing hysterically and begging him for a second chance. She grabbed at his pant legs, pleading that she would change and begging him not to throw her out into the street. She cried that she had nowhere else to go. The absolute crushing reality of her catastrophic situation crashed down on her all at once. Her brother's secret financial allowance was completely gone because I had cut Julian off. Her mother's retirement fund was empty because she had stolen it all. And now her highly successful doctor husband was forcefully evicting her from her luxurious, comfortable life. She was entirely destitute and utterly alone. Marcus simply stepped back, peeling her desperate hands off his legs as if she was a disgusting disease he refused to catch. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her wailing loudly on the floor, surrounded by the scattered papers that documented her total self-destruction. Victoria gripped the steering wheel of her luxury vehicle with white-knuckled rage as she sped aggressively away from the preschool. The heavy manila envelope containing the emergency restraining order sat on her passenger seat like a physical manifestation of her utter defeat. She was shaking uncontrollably. Her mind frantically replayed the cold, terrifying whisper I had delivered right into her ear. I had told her to go home and check her credit card statements because I had just sent Marcus her financial history. She refused to look at her phone while driving. She was too terrified of what she might find. Instead, she focused her frantic, desperate energy on reaching Sloane. For years, Victoria had treated her daughter as her ultimate ally and her perfect golden child. She desperately needed Sloane to validate her intense anger. She needed her daughter to comfort her and help her formulate a vicious plan to destroy me so they could reclaim their stolen wealth. She pulled up to the security gate of Sloane and Marcus' upscale neighborhood, completely ignoring the guard as she sped through toward their sprawling modern home. As Victoria aggressively parked her vehicle in the wide paved driveway, she immediately realized something was horribly wrong. The heavy custom front door of the massive house was thrown wide open. Marcus was standing on the front porch, dressed in his medical scrubs, looking absolutely furious. He held a massive, heavy designer suitcase by the handle. With one powerful heave, he tossed the expensive luggage directly onto the manicured front lawn. The bag tumbled across the green grass and burst completely open, spilling Sloane custom silk dresses and expensive high heels all over the yard. Sloane stumbled out the front door right behind the luggage, sobbing hysterically with her expensive makeup running in thick black streaks down her face. She was begging and pleading, grabbing wildly at the air as Marcus stepped back and firmly crossed his muscular arms. Victoria felt a massive surge of arrogant, protective rage. She slammed her car door shut and marched aggressively across the lawn, screaming at Marcus. She demanded to know what on earth he thought he was doing to her daughter. She yelled that he had absolutely no right to treat a woman of Sloane high social standing like common street trash. She ordered him to pick up the clothes and apologize immediately. Marcus did not yell back. He did not flinch at her screeching commands. He turned his head slowly and looked at Victoria with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. It was the exact kind of look a brilliant surgeon reserves for a festering, incurable disease. He walked slowly down the porch steps and stopped right in front of his mother-in-law. He did not show her a single ounce of the polite respect he had always offered her in the past. He pointed a firm, steady finger directly at Sloane, who was currently kneeling on the grass, desperately trying to gather her expensive shoes. "Your perfect daughter is a cheating, parasitic fraud," Marcus stated, his deep voice carrying clearly across the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. "I am filing for divorce this afternoon, and I am completely cutting off every single financial tie to this incredibly toxic family. I am done paying for her pathetic luxury lifestyle while she sleeps with a 22-year-old gym trainer in hotel rooms I unknowingly financed." Victoria gasped loudly and pressed her manicured hand to her chest. She looked at Sloane in absolute shock, but Marcus was not finished delivering the total destruction of their alliance. He reached into his scrub pocket and pulled out the thick stack of printed bank statements I had emailed him. He slapped the heavy stack of papers directly into Victoria's hands. "Ask your daughter how she was paying for those luxury hotels when my credit cards were finally maxed out," Marcus demanded coldly. "Ask her exactly where she got the cash to buy her little boyfriend a sports car lease. Because my forensic audit shows she did not just steal from me, Victoria. She completely drained your entire retirement portfolio. She forged your signature and liquidated your safe mutual funds to buy herself designer purses while pretending she was attending charity events." Victoria's heart completely stopped beating. The world around her seemed to violently freeze. She looked down at the highlighted bank statements trembling in her hands. She saw the undeniable transfer logs. She saw the massive catastrophic withdrawals from the retirement accounts she had spent decades building. The massive safety net she believed would protect her old age was entirely gone. Every single cent had been funneled directly into Sloane's private checking account to fund a fake socialite lifestyle. Marcus looked at the two women with cold, absolute finality. "You two absolutely deserve each other," he said firmly. He turned around, walked back up the porch steps, and slammed the heavy front door, shutting them out of his life forever. The loud, heavy click of the deadbolt echoed across the quiet lawn. Victoria stood perfectly still on the grass. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy family completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. For years, she had foolishly enabled Sloane's toxic behavior, constantly praising her as the golden child while relentlessly bullying me. She had firmly believed Sloane was a flawless reflection of her own superior parenting. Now she realized her beautiful daughter had methodically robbed her blind, leaving her entirely destitute. Sloane looked up from the grass, wiping her running mascara. She tried to stammer out a pathetic, desperate excuse. She cried that Julian was the one who had abruptly cut off her secret allowances and forced her into a desperate financial corner. She actually accused her mother of caring more about money than her own daughter's well-being. The sheer audacity of that pathetic excuse completely snapped Victoria's mind. Victoria lunged forward with terrifying speed and slapped her daughter hard across the face. The sharp, cracking sound of the physical blow echoed loudly across the open yard. "You stole from me!" Victoria screamed, her voice breaking under the crushing weight of the profound betrayal. "You forged my name and drained my retirement accounts. I trusted you with my financial future, and you treated me like a personal cash machine while you were sleeping with some cheap trainer. You ruined us." Sloane stumbled backward, holding her red, stinging cheek. Her fake tears instantly morphed into vicious defensive rage. She screamed right back at her mother, hurling years of repressed resentment and highly toxic insults. She yelled that Victoria was a bitter, aging woman who only cared about country club status and expensive pearls. She blamed her mother for raising her to believe she never had to work a real day in her life. The two women completely lost their minds. They began physically attacking each other right there in the middle of the expensive neighborhood. Victoria grabbed a handful of Sloane hair, pulling violently, while Sloane wildly swung her heavy designer purse, striking her mother hard in the shoulder. They screamed and cursed and slapped each other, stumbling viciously across the scattered expensive clothing on the lawn. Neighbors began stepping out of their million-dollar homes, holding their smartphones up to record the incredibly trashy spectacle. The wealthy elite social circle they had both desperately worshipped for years was currently watching them tear each other apart like wild rabid animals. Their arrogant alliance was entirely dead. They had absolutely nothing left but their own toxic hatred, and they were turning it completely on each other. While his mother and sister were busy physically destroying each other on a manicured lawn, Julian was sitting in his empty rental house, hatching a plan of pure, desperate delusion. He was a cornered animal, completely drowning in massive debt and facing imminent eviction. But his massive ego absolutely refused to accept defeat. Instead of reflecting on his toxic behavior, he decided to double down. In a fit of sheer arrogant desperation, he took out a massive, high-interest predatory loan just to afford the retainer fee for the most notorious and ruthless shark of a divorce attorney in the entire city. Julian spent his days pacing the empty hardwood floors, completely convincing himself that state marital property laws guaranteed him an automatic 50% of my massive financial technology empire. He aggressively vowed to march into our upcoming legal mediation and completely strip me of my company, my wealth, and my child. He was absolutely certain he was going to win. He had absolutely no idea he was walking blindly into a devastating legal trap he had actually built with his own 2 hands. 2 weeks later, the crisp autumn air matched the incredibly cold and sterile atmosphere inside the corporate mediation room. We were gathered in a high-rise office building downtown, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering a sweeping view of the sprawling Chicago skyline. I sat perfectly still in my comfortable black leather chair, projecting an image of absolute professional composure. Sitting directly to my right was my fiercely intelligent senior corporate attorney, Harrison. We had arrived 15 minutes early just to establish a quiet, dominating presence over the space. I focused on my steady, calm breathing, refusing to let the hostile legal environment intimidate me. The heavy glass door swung open, and Julian confidently marched into the room. I was wearing a brand-new designer suit that was noticeably sharper than anything he had previously owned. I knew his financial situation was absolutely dire, so the only logical explanation was that he had purchased the extravagant outfit using his high-interest predatory loans, desperately trying to project an illusion of wealth he no longer possessed. He strutted over to the table, pulling out the chair directly across from me with exaggerated force. He offered me a smug, condescending smile, clearly believing he was walking into this mediation holding all the winning cards. Right behind him walked his newly retained legal counsel. Julian had clearly hired the most ruthless, aggressive shark of a lawyer he could find in the entire city. The man had slicked back hair, a loud, pinstriped suit, and an arrogant swagger that perfectly mirrored Julian's inflated ego. The lawyer dropped his thick leather briefcase onto the glass table with a loud, echoing thud. He did not bother to offer a polite introduction. He simply pulled out a massive stack of demanding legal documents and slapped them down forcefully in the center of the table. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the cool glass, looking directly at Harrison with a predatory grin. "We are not here to waste time playing nice," the opposing lawyer barked aggressively. "My client is the primary breadwinner of this household, and he has suffered severe emotional and financial distress due to your client's deceptive actions. We have drawn up a comprehensive list of absolutely non-negotiable demands." The lawyer arrogantly tapped the thick stack of papers. "We demand permanent joint custody of the child. Furthermore, we now demand substantial monthly alimony payments to maintain the lavish standard of living my client has grown accustomed to. Most importantly, we are here to discuss the division of marital assets, specifically the financial technology venture capital firm your client secretly built." The aggressive lawyer sneered, puffing out his chest. "Your client started this highly lucrative business while she was legally married to my client. Under the marital property laws of this state, any business created during the union is considered a shared asset, regardless of whose name is on the operating agreement. She built it during the marriage, so my client is legally entitled to his 50%. He now demands half of the company, half of the massive corporate dividends, and half of the real estate portfolio purchased with those exact funds. I sat in absolute silence. I did not react to the absurd, greedy demands. I did not display a single ounce of fear or frustration. I simply folded my hands together in my lap and let the heavy silence stretch across the cold glass table. My calm demeanor seemed to embolden Julian. He interpreted my silence as total submission. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest and letting out a low, mocking laugh. "You really thought you could hide millions of dollars from me?" Julian gloated, his voice dripping with pure arrogance. "You thought you could just kick me out of my own house and leave me with nothing? Did you honestly believe your little tech firm belonged only to you? I am going to take my 50% and I am going to use my half of your money to buy a real mansion that I actually own. You are going to be paying for my luxurious lifestyle for the rest of your natural life. You should have just apologized to my mother when you had the chance." I watched him speak, letting him hang himself with his own arrogant delusions. When Julian finally ran out of breath, he sat back with a triumphant smirk, fully expecting Harrison to begin desperately negotiating a settlement. He thought he had successfully cornered me. The aggressive lawyer beside him mirrored his smug expression, waiting for our panicked response. Harrison simply adjusted his glasses and looked at the two men with an expression of mild, polite amusement. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue about marital property laws or attempt to negotiate the ridiculous custody and alimony demands. He reached down into his slim leather briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. The room was absolutely still as Harrison smoothly pulled his hand back out. He placed a single, heavily notarized document directly in the center of the glass table. Julian stared down at it with a look of mild irritation, clearly assuming it was just some meaningless administrative form. His aggressive attorney, however, did not share his misplaced confidence. The older man snatched the heavy packet from the table, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the bold legal heading printed across the very first page. I watched in absolute silence as the arrogant smirk completely melted off the opposing lawyer face. It was instantly replaced by a rigid, tight-jawed expression of sheer professional panic. He quickly flipped to the second page, and then the third, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. He was reading the airtight clauses, and the undeniable reality of his client-doomed situation was rapidly sinking in. "What is that?" Julian demanded, his voice laced with sudden annoyance. "Stop wasting time reading their garbage and tell them we are not accepting anything less than 50%. The lawyer did not answer him. Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms comfortably on the glass table. His voice was calm, authoritative, and completely unapologetic. "That document, Julian, is the exact reason why you will not be receiving 50% of my client company. In fact, you will not be receiving a single dime of corporate dividends, a fraction of her real estate holdings, or any alimony whatsoever. You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing." Julian let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. "You are completely bluffing," he snapped, leaning forward aggressively. "I know my rights as a husband. Any business she built while we were married is marital property. You cannot just forge a piece of paper to magically erase my legal entitlement." Harrison offered a slow, chilling smile. "I completely agree that the law generally favors a fair division of marital assets," Harrison replied smoothly. "However, the court also highly respects legally binding postnuptial agreements, especially when they are drafted and executed at the explicit, forceful demand of the husband." Julian froze. The color instantly drained from his arrogant face as a distant, uncomfortable memory finally broke through his thick wall of denial. "Let us take a quick trip down memory lane," Harrison suggested, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. "Exactly 3 years ago, my client's startup hit a severe financial roadblock. She desperately needed a tiny $10,000 bridge loan to keep her secure servers operational. She came to you asking for a temporary financial lifeline to save the company she was working so incredibly hard to build. You flatly refused her request. You told her that her business was a massive, pathetic failure. But you did not just stop at refusing to help your struggling wife. You were absolutely terrified that her corporate debt would somehow attach to your name and ruin your pristine personal credit score. So you hired your own cheap attorney. You had that attorney draft the most ruthless postnuptial contract legally possible, and you forced Chloe to sign it at your kitchen table, threatening to divorce her right then and there if she refused. Julian was visibly shaking now. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the thick document out of his lawyer's motionless grip. He flipped directly to the final page. There, staring back at him in bold black ink, was his own hurried signature right next to mine. That contract you forced upon my client legally severed your financial ties to her business entirely. Harrison explained, his tone dripping with mockery. You explicitly waived all liabilities and all debts associated with her firm. But in your selfish rush to insulate yourself from her perceived failure, you also legally waived any and all future rights claims, equity, and entitlements to her corporate profits. You permanently locked yourself completely out of her massive financial success. You explicitly stated that the business and all assets purchased with its dividends would remain her sole and separate property in perpetuity. You literally signed away your right to the 50% you are sitting here demanding today. Julian dropped the document onto the glass table as if it had suddenly caught fire. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his catastrophic blunder crushed him instantly. By trying to protect his own selfish interests over a mere $10,000, he had legally isolated himself from a company that was now worth tens of millions. The devastating silence in the mediation room was finally broken by the sound of heavy brass latches snapping shut. Julian turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with desperate panic. His expensive, aggressive lawyer was hurriedly packing his thick leather briefcase. The older man was shoving his legal pads and negotiation forms back into his bag with rapid, agitated movements. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. "We need to fight this. We have to find a loophole to invalidate the contract." The lawyer paused and looked down at Julian with pure, absolute disgust. "There is no loophole," he stated coldly, snapping his briefcase shut. "You signed a legally binding document that completely strips you of any claim to her wealth. You have absolutely no liquid assets, and your bank accounts are empty." The lawyer grabbed the handle of his briefcase, taking a deliberate step away from the table. "My retainer fee for a complex contested divorce trial is $50,000, and I require payment up front. Since you have no access to your wife's fortune and no realistic way to pay for my continued legal services, I am withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately. Good luck, Julian. You are going to need it." The ruthless lawyer turned on his heel and walked out of the glass corporate room, letting the heavy door slam loudly behind him. Julian was left sitting at the massive table completely alone, penniless, and utterly defenseless against the storm he had created. Julian sat completely paralyzed in the silent corporate mediation room. The echo of the heavy door slamming shut behind his retreating lawyer seemed to vibrate through his entire body. He looked down at his trembling hands resting on the cold glass table. His mind raced frantically through the catastrophic events of the past few weeks. He had absolutely no lawyer. He had zero access to my massive fortune. He had less than 2 weeks before law enforcement would physically remove him from the sprawling estate he had falsely claimed as his own. His credit cards were entirely maxed out, and the high-interest predatory loans he had taken out to hire that ruthless attorney were already accumulating massive daily financial penalties. He was drowning in a deep, terrifying ocean of debt and total humiliation. He slowly closed his eyes, trying to stop the room from spinning. Then a sudden desperate thought pierced through his overwhelming panic. He still had his career. I was still a senior wealth manager at a highly successful financial firm. More importantly, his firm was currently in the final stages of being acquired by a massive global venture capital fund. The upcoming corporate acquisition was the worst-kept secret in his office. The senior partners had practically guaranteed him that if he successfully navigated the transition period, he would be promoted to a senior vice president role within the new parent company. That elite promotion came with a massive 7-figure executive retention bonus. If he could just hold on a little longer, that bonus would be more than enough to pay off his mounting predatory debts, secure a new luxury apartment, and save him from total financial bankruptcy. His deeply narcissistic mind instantly latched onto this single lifeline. He completely ignored the reality of his massive incompetence and the fraudulent sales numbers he had been submitting for months. He genuinely believed his own fabricated lies. He convinced himself that the new acquiring chief executive officer would view his heavily doctored performance metrics and immediately crown him as the absolute golden boy of the transition. Over the next 3 days, Julian paced the empty, echoing halls of the rental mansion he was about to lose. The moving boxes he had reluctantly purchased sat completely empty in the grand foyer. He could not afford a professional moving company, and he had nowhere to take his expensive custom furniture anyway. He was entirely isolated from his mother and sister, who were currently too busy fighting their own vicious legal battles to answer his phone calls. Yet despite his desperate reality, his towering arrogance began to return. He convinced himself that my decisive legal victories were just a temporary setback. He believed that once he secured his 7-figure bonus, he would instantly regain the upper hand. He decided he needed to manipulate me into dropping the aggressive legal assault before the judge could finalize his total destruction. He poured himself a glass of cheap whiskey and picked up his smartphone. He dialed my number, intending to use his impending imaginary wealth to force me back into submission. Miles away in my secure downtown hotel suite, I was sitting at my glass desk, reviewing a complex set of digital financial audits. Theo was sound asleep in the adjoining bedroom, exhausted from a fun afternoon visiting the local aquarium. When my cell phone began to ring, I glanced at the bright screen and saw Julian's name. I considered letting it go straight to voicemail, but a calm, cold curiosity washed over me. I pressed the answer button and put him on speakerphone. I did not offer a greeting. I simply let the silence stretch, waiting for him to speak first. "Chloe," he breathed out, his voice thick with manufactured magnanimity. "Please do not hang up on me. I am calling because I am willing to be the bigger person here. I know you have been throwing a massive temper tantrum with all these lawyers and evictions, but we do not need to destroy each other. I am willing to give you one final chance to fix this before it is too late for you." I stopped typing on my laptop and leaned back in my comfortable chair, genuinely amused by his pathetic attempt at manipulation. He was completely bankrupt and facing imminent eviction. Yet he was still speaking to me like a benevolent king, addressing a disobedient peasant. "How exactly do you propose we fix this, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice deceptively mild. I took my calm question as a sign of desperate weakness. He eagerly grasped the tiny lifeline, feeling a massive surge of his old toxic arrogance returning. "I have massive news, Chloe," he bragged, his voice gaining strength and volume. "My firm is being acquired by a massive global conglomerate next week. It is a multi-million-dollar buyout. I am being promoted to senior vice president of the new parent company. I am getting a massive 7-figure executive retention bonus as soon as the ink dries on the merger documents. I am going to have more money than I even know what to do with. I am calling to offer you a deal. If you drop this ridiculous divorce call off the lawyers and apologize to me right now, I promise I will take care of you and Theo. We can buy a brand new house. You will not have to hide your little tech company anymore because I will be a millionaire. I can even help you run your business. But if you refuse, you will miss out on my new wealth forever." I actually laughed softly into the quiet hotel room. The sheer staggering delusion of the man was almost difficult to comprehend. He was facing total financial ruin, and he was still desperately trying to position himself as my wealthy savior. He still firmly believed he was vastly superior to me. I looked at the bright laptop screen directly in front of me. Displayed clearly on the monitor was the highly confidential internal audit of his specific sales department. The audit was commissioned by my own venture capital firm because I was the chief executive officer of the very company acquiring his firm. I was staring at undeniable digital proof of his massive corporate embezzlement. "I do not need you to take care of me, Julian," I stated coldly, cutting off his arrogant rambling. "And I certainly do not need your pathetic help running my highly successful corporate enterprise. Enjoy your upcoming acquisition. I am absolutely sure it will be an incredibly eye-opening experience for you." Before he could utter another desperate promise, I reached out and ended the call. I dropped my phone back onto the glass desk and shook my head. Julian was clinging to a fragile, fabricated illusion, completely unaware of the massive corporate storm gathering directly over his head. He thought he was walking into a glamorous celebration of his own success. He had absolutely no idea that he had just invited himself to his own public execution. The days leading up to the grand merger gala were a masterclass in pathetic delusion. Julian was completely bankrupt. He was facing imminent eviction, and he had absolutely nowhere else to go. Yet he stubbornly pinned his entire survival on this single corporate event. He desperately needed to look like a man of immense wealth and unshakable stability. But his credit cards were entirely maxed out, and his bank accounts were severely overdrawn. He was forced to visit a discount formal wear shop in a rundown strip mall just to rent a tuxedo he could barely afford. The rented black suit hung slightly loose on his shoulders, a far cry from the custom-tailored Italian suits he used to purchase using my corporate dividends. He practiced his handshake in the mirror, pretending he was already a senior executive. He sprayed on his favorite expensive cologne, hoping the familiar scent would mask the undeniable stench of his mounting desperation. He demanded that his mother accompany him to the prestigious event. Victoria was more than eager to attend the glamorous gathering. Her entire world had been completely obliterated after the vicious physical brawl with Sloane on the front lawn. She was practically destitute, and her social standing in their affluent community was rapidly crumbling. She clung to Julian and his impending executive bonus as her absolute last remaining lifeline. She squeezed herself into an old designer gown from her dusty closet and applied heavy makeup to hide the dark, exhausted circles under her aging eyes. She firmly believed that tonight was the night her brilliant son would miraculously save them both from financial ruin and restore their elite social dominance. The heavy glass doors of the legendary Waldorf Astoria Hotel were held open by white-gloved staff members, and they stepped into the opulent lobby. The historic venue was absolutely dripping in unadulterated luxury. Crystal chandeliers roughly the size of small vehicles hung suspended from the intricately painted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. A talented string quartet played classical music, filling the expansive space with an atmosphere of sophisticated elegance. Waitstaff dressed in immaculate black and white uniforms circulated smoothly through the growing crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of premium champagne. It was the exact kind of high society corporate environment Julian had always desperately tried to emulate. Julian marched through the massive ballroom doors with an aggressive swagger, completely ignoring the uncomfortable tightness of his cheap rented tuxedo. He grabbed a glass of champagne off a passing tray without acknowledging the server and immediately began scanning the room for the most important executives. He strutted across the intricate patterned carpet, inserting himself into conversations with senior partners and aggressive investors. He laughed entirely too loudly at their jokes and aggressively slapped men on the back, trying to project the image of a fearless corporate titan. Whenever the topic of the recent corporate financial performance came up, Julian immediately dominated the discussion. He loudly took absolute credit for every single positive sales metric his entire department had produced over the last fiscal year. He boasted about his brilliant leadership strategies and claimed he was the sole reason the acquisition was even taking place. He painted himself as the indispensable founding father of the firm, completely oblivious to the fact that his fraudulent offshore accounts and fabricated retention numbers were currently resting safely inside my small evening clutch. Victoria walked closely beside him, clinging to his arm like a desperate woman clinging to a life raft. She deliberately sought out the wives of the other senior executives, cornering them near the towering ice sculptures. She aggressively boasted about Julian and his imminent promotion to senior vice president of the new parent company. She loudly bragged about the massive wealth her son was about to secure, speaking to the other women as if they were entirely beneath her. She desperately needed them to feel jealous and intimidated. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom began to subtly shift. A low, nervous murmur started to ripple through the densely packed crowd of executives and managers. The polite networking conversations slowly turned into hushed, urgent whispers. People were discreetly checking their phones and exchanging worried glances over their champagne glasses. The members of the acquiring corporate board of directors had begun filtering into the room, taking their places near the front of the massive stage. They carried an intimidating aura of absolute authority, and they were not smiling or mingling with the crowd. The rumor spreading rapidly through the room was that the new chief executive officer of the acquiring megafund was absolutely ruthless. The whispers claimed that this mysterious visionary founder had ordered a massive, uncompromising deep dive into the internal audits during the final due diligence phase. Julian scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at his terrified colleagues. He took another large gulp of his champagne and let out a loud, arrogant laugh that carried over the anxious murmurs of the crowd. He completely refused to entertain the idea that his carefully constructed house of cards was currently collapsing around him. He loudly assured his panicked peers that his personal sales figures were the absolute backbone of the entire organization. He actually boasted that if this new, ruthless chief executive officer was as smart as everyone claimed, she would probably call him up to the main stage and hand him a medal for carrying the company on his back. He straightened his cheap rented bow tie and confidently took another sip of his drink, entirely blind to the massive corporate storm gathering directly over his head. The soft classical music playing in the background faded away. The bright crystal chandeliers illuminating the massive room slowly dimmed, casting a dramatic hush over the hundreds of anxious corporate guests. The low murmurs and whispers instantly died out, leaving a heavy, tense silence in the grand space. A single bright spotlight snapped on, illuminating the polished wooden podium at the center of the stage. The chairman of the board, a distinguished older man with silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit, stepped confidently up to the microphone. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the opening remarks. He spoke with a commanding voice that echoed through the silent ballroom. "It is my profound honor to introduce a leader whose brilliant analytical mind and unmatched drive have completely revolutionized our industry." The chairman announced, his voice resonating powerfully across the grand space. "Please join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer of our acquiring fund." The entire ballroom erupted into polite, eager applause. Every single head turned expectantly toward the front of the room, but the chairman gestured warmly toward the back of the venue. The two massive oak doors at the very rear of the ballroom slowly swung open, pulled wide by the hotel staff. The bright hallway light spilled into the dim, elegant room, casting a long, dramatic shadow across the intricate patterned carpet. I stepped into the spotlight. My posture was perfectly straight, and my head was held high. I wore a stunning, floor-length emerald green silk gown that draped perfectly across my figure, projecting an image of sharp, undeniable power and ultimate grace. I looked like a woman who was in absolute control of her own destiny. As I moved down the center aisle, the dense crowd of wealthy investors and corporate managers naturally parted to make way for me. I kept my gaze fixed forward, maintaining an expression of absolute unyielding authority. I was about halfway down the long center aisle when I passed the massive ice sculpture where Victoria had planted herself. I turned my head just a fraction of an inch and locked eyes directly with her. I watched the blood completely drain from her heavily powdered face. Her jaw went slack, and her eyes widened in a look of absolute sheer terror. Her fingers simply gave out. The delicate crystal flute slipped from her frozen grip and fell directly onto the hard marble floor. The glass shattered into 1,000 tiny, glittering pieces, sending a splash of pale champagne across the hem of her outdated designer gown. She was entirely paralyzed, her mind violently rejecting the impossible reality unfolding right in front of her. A few yards closer to the stage, Julian was standing with a senior director from his sales department. He had been clapping along with the rest of the room, eager to grovel to his new wealthy boss. When the crowd parted and he finally saw me walking down the aisle, the applause died completely on his hands. His arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, sickening confusion. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly. In his deeply narcissistic mind, there was absolutely no logical reason for his soon-to-be ex-wife to be walking down the center aisle at his highly exclusive corporate merger gala. He genuinely thought I must have somehow suffered a massive psychological break. He assumed I had completely lost my mind, stalked him to the luxury hotel, and crashed the private event just to cause a humiliating public scene. The panic rising in his chest quickly ignited into defensive, furious anger. He was absolutely terrified that my presence would ruin his chances of securing the massive executive retention bonus he desperately needed to avoid total bankruptcy. He threw his shoulders back and aggressively pushed his way through the crowd of executives, stepping directly into the center aisle to physically block my path. He closed the distance between us, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He stopped less than 2 feet in front of me, planting his feet firmly on the carpet. "What on earth do you think you are doing here, Chloe?" he hissed, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper, meant only for me. "You are completely insane. You need to turn around and leave this building right now before you ruin my career." I stopped walking and looked up at him. I did not step back, and I did not shrink away from his aggressive stance. Security. Julian yelled, raising his hand and waving frantically toward the back of the room. "We have a hostile trespasser. Get security over here immediately and remove this woman from the premises." A tense, heavy silence fell over the immediate area. The surrounding executives stared at Julian in absolute shock. They could not believe a mid-level sales manager was aggressively screaming for security to remove the incoming chief executive officer at her own welcoming gala. Julian kept glaring at me, completely blind to the horrified reactions of his peers. He reached out to grab my arm, intending to physically pull me toward the exit. Before his fingers could even brush the silk fabric of my gown, a firm, authoritative voice cut sharply through the tense air. "Take your hands off of her this instant," the chairman of the board commanded, stepping down from the low stage and walking directly toward us. His tone was laced with pure professional fury. Julian froze, his arm suspended in midair. He looked at the powerful older man with a mix of eager deference and deep confusion. "Sir, I apologize for this ridiculous disruption," Julian stammered quickly, attempting to put on his charming corporate smile. "This woman is my estranged wife. She is currently going through a severe mental health crisis, and she is completely unstable. She has absolutely no business being at this private corporate event. I am trying to have her removed so we can proceed with the celebration." The chairman did not look at Julian. He looked at me with an expression of profound respect and mild amusement. "Is there a problem here, Chloe?" he asked calmly, ignoring my husband entirely. "No problem at all," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "Just a minor obstacle that is easily bypassed." Julian stood absolutely frozen as the impossible truth finally crashed down upon his extremely arrogant mind. He slowly lowered his arm, his eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the deeply respectful posture of the wealthy chairman. The chairman stepped forward, shook my hand firmly, and handed me the heavy wireless microphone. I tapped it once and looked directly at Julian, ready to deliver the final devastating blow. I stepped past Julian, leaving him entirely paralyzed in the center aisle. I walked up the short steps to the elevated stage and stood firmly behind the polished wooden podium. I looked out over the massive sea of anxious faces. Hundreds of the most powerful and influential financial executives in Chicago and New York were staring up at me, waiting for my opening address. "Thank you all for welcoming my firm," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the premium sound system. "As your new chief executive officer, I have some immediate structural changes to announce tonight." The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely palpable. I did not wait for the crowd to recover from their initial shock. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out a sleek wireless presentation clicker. With a single deliberate press, the massive high-definition screen suspended behind the stage instantly illuminated. The standard corporate welcoming logo faded away and was immediately replaced by a series of highly complex financial spreadsheets and damning data graphs. The metrics were dense, but my data analytics team had explicitly highlighted the critical fraudulent figures in bright neon red. I walked slowly across the stage, my voice projecting with absolute unyielding authority. I directed their full, undivided attention to the very first set of alarming data points projected on the bright screen. I calmly explained that during our rigorous due diligence phase, our proprietary analytical software had uncovered severe catastrophic discrepancies hidden deep within the wealth management and sales department. I pointed directly to the fabricated client retention numbers. I detailed exactly how the regional sales data had been artificially and illegally inflated for the past 8 months just to secure unearned quarterly executive bonuses. The crowd of seasoned professionals stared up at the massive screens in pure absolute disbelief. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a devastating financial reality. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of personal emotion. I maintained an ice-cold professional demeanor as I broke down the undeniable evidence of massive corporate embezzlement. I displayed the irrefutable digital audit trail, showing exactly how tens of thousands of dollars of company funds had been systematically funneled into hidden offshore accounts. I explained how luxury hotel stays, expensive tailored suits, private golf club memberships, and lavish personal dinners had been illegally masked and approved as necessary business expenses. I laid out the entire fraudulent operation piece by piece for the entire financial industry to witness. The sheer terrifying scale of the reckless theft was projected in massive glowing numbers for peers, competitors, and the entire board of directors to evaluate. I stopped pacing and turned my full attention back to the center of the ballroom. I locked eyes directly with the man who had tormented and degraded me for years. I clicked the presentation clicker one final time. The screen shifted to display the exact employee credentials used to approve every single fraudulent transaction. Julian name and executive identification number flashed across the massive screen in bold, undeniable red lettering. The people Julian had spent years desperately trying to impress were reading the date's account numbers and illegal approval codes for themselves. The men standing near him, the same cowardly directors he had been arrogantly boasting to just minutes prior, began to instinctively step away from him. They shuffled backward, putting as much physical distance between themselves and him as possible. They looked at him as if he was suddenly contagious and radioactive. Within seconds, Julian was left standing completely alone in the center of a wide, empty circle on the patterned carpet. The grand illusion of his massive corporate success was permanently shattered. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his arrogant life, no confident explanation came out. He had spent years treating everyone around him like garbage because he firmly believed he was an untouchable titan of industry. Now his sheer incompetence and criminal behavior were being broadcast live to the entire financial world. I looked down at him from the elevated stage and delivered the final absolute blow. "Julian," I said, my voice echoing loudly through the silent ballroom, "Human Resources and our Corporate Security Division are waiting for you in the lobby. You are terminated effective immediately. Furthermore, my legal team has already handed this entire unredacted audit report directly to federal investigators. We will be pursuing aggressive criminal charges for the embezzled corporate funds." The finality of my cold words seemed to completely snap whatever fragile thread was still holding his arrogant mind together. Julian collapsed under the crushing weight of his sudden, absolute destruction. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and his knees buckled slightly, causing him to stumble awkwardly on the carpet. The man who had thrown a glass of red wine on my chest and ordered me out of my own home was entirely gone. In his place stood a pathetic, terrified shell of a human being. He looked around wildly at the horrified, disgusted faces of his colleagues, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He tried to speak to the board members standing near the front of the stage, stammering out frantic, incoherent excuses. The chairman simply turned his back on him, utterly repulsed by the pathetic display. I gave a subtle, sharp nod toward the back doors. 4 broad-shouldered security guards dressed in crisp black suits stepped forward from the shadows. They marched swiftly and purposefully down the center aisle. They reached the empty circle where Julian stood and firmly grabbed him by both of his arms, pulling them forcefully behind his back. The distinct, terrifying click of metal handcuffs echoed loudly in the silent room. Julian did not try to fight them. He just wept loudly, his shoulders shaking violently as they forcibly dragged his ruined life out of the elegant ballroom. Near the ice sculpture, Victoria watched the complete and total destruction of her precious golden child. The shock was entirely too much for her fragile, aging heart to bear. She let out a weak, gasping choke, and her eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed completely, passing out cold and falling heavily into the puddle of shattered glass, and spilled premium champagne on the marble floor. No one rushed to help her. They simply stepped over her ruined designer gown, completely disgusted by the toxic, fraudulent family that had just been permanently excised from their elite world. The heavy, solid oak doors slammed shut behind Julian, finalizing his total corporate and social execution. The heavy oak doors closing at the back of that ballroom did not just mark the end of a corporate presentation. It marked the permanent end of my toxic marriage and their entire reign of terror. For the first time in 3 years, the air around me felt entirely clean. People often think the best part of revenge is the loud, explosive confrontation, but they are entirely wrong. The true beauty of finally taking out the trash is not the loud, chaotic noise of the garbage truck pulling away. It is the profound, beautiful, absolute silence that follows. The fallout over the next few months was as swift as it was entirely devastating for the people who had tried to break me. The federal authorities did not waste any time building their criminal case against Julian. Because my corporate data team had handed over a perfectly documented, unredacted financial audit, the prosecution had an airtight case of massive corporate fraud, wire fraud, and severe embezzlement. Julian had absolutely no access to marital funds, and his high-interest predatory loans had completely dried up. The ruthless shark of a lawyer he had tried to hire was long gone. Julian was forced to rely on an overworked public defender to face down a team of ruthless federal prosecutors. The arrogant man who used to boast about six-figure executive bonuses and wear custom-tailored Italian suits to luxury galas had to stand in a sterile courtroom wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He cried and begged the judge for leniency, but the undeniable digital evidence offered him absolutely no mercy. Julian was ultimately convicted on multiple felony charges and sentenced to a lengthy term in a federal penitentiary. He lost his prestigious financial licenses forever. The banking industry permanently blacklisted his name. When he finally finishes his prison sentence, he will not be returning to a life of luxury or corporate power. He will be walking out into a massive mountain of court-ordered financial restitution and compounding predatory debt that will quite literally follow him to his grave. He will spend the rest of his miserable life working minimum wage jobs just to pay off the massive penalties of his own arrogant greed. His mother and his sister did not fare any better in the harsh, unforgiving reality of their new impoverished lives. With Julian locked away in a federal cell and my massive corporate wealth completely out of their reach, Victoria and Sloane were legally evicted from my sprawling suburban mansion right on schedule. Marcus had successfully finalized his aggressive divorce, completely cutting Sloane off from his lucrative medical salary. He ensured she walked away with absolutely nothing but the designer clothes she managed to salvage from the front lawn that day. Victoria had no retirement funds left because her own daughter had stolen every last cent. The two women were violently stripped of their stolen wealth and forced to move into a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable, rundown neighborhood far outside the Chicago city limits. Their highly toxic relationship rapidly deteriorated in that confined, depressing space. The walls of their cheap apartment are thin, and their neighbors frequently complain about their constant screaming matches. They spend their miserable days endlessly bickering and viciously blaming each other for their total financial and social ruin. The elite country club community they had once ruled with their arrogant gossip completely turned their backs on them. They became absolute social pariahs. They were blocked by every single wealthy friend they had ever tried to impress and permanently exiled from the high society world they valued more than basic human decency. Without Julian to fund their luxury shopping habits and expensive beauty treatments, they were finally forced to face the miserable, shallow reality of who they actually were. They are trapped in a prison of their own making, locked in a tiny apartment with the one person they despise the most. But while their toxic world burned entirely to the ground, the people who actually deserved peace were thriving beautifully. Marcus is doing incredibly well. He completely refurbished his beautiful modern home, erasing every single trace of Sloane from his life. His orthopedic surgical career is more successful than ever before, and he is highly respected in the medical community. He did not let the trauma of his ex-wife's massive betrayal turn him into a bitter or angry person. Because he is a genuinely good and honest man, he kept his dignity and his peace of mind. He and I maintained a very healthy mutual respect. We both survived the exact same toxic family and came out stronger on the other side. Just last week, he sent a beautiful handcrafted wooden train set to my house for Theo's 4th birthday. It was a simple, quiet gesture that proved a profound point. Good people who operate with absolute integrity will always receive goodness in return, while toxic parasites will inevitably consume themselves. I am currently sitting on the expansive glass balcony of my brand-new lakefront penthouse overlooking the beautiful, deep blue waters of Lake Michigan. The late afternoon sun is casting a warm, golden glow across the sprawling Chicago skyline. I lean back in my plush outdoor lounge chair and take a slow, savoring sip of a deeply rich vintage red wine. The dark liquid no longer reminds me of the cold splash of disrespect I endured at that horrible dining room table. Instead, it tastes like pure, unadulterated freedom. Inside the massive, open-concept living room, my son Theo is running happily across the soft custom rugs. He is laughing loudly as he plays with the wooden train set Marcus sent him. His joyful, innocent voice echoes through the peaceful space, completely untouched by the toxic chaos his father tried to drag him into. He is entirely safe, and he will grow up in a home filled with genuine respect and unconditional love. I rest my wine glass on the sleek glass table and look down over the balcony edge toward the private, secured courtyard below. Parked perfectly in my designated executive space is the cherry-red Ferrari. The pristine luxury sports car is gleaming brilliantly under the bright afternoon sun. It sits there as a permanent physical reminder of the exact night I finally decided to stop shrinking myself. It is a monument to the moment I grabbed those silver keys and drove away from a life of quiet desperation. I look at the beautiful machine, and I do not feel a single trace of sadness or regret. I have not shed a single tear for the pathetic, arrogant man who ordered me to pack my bags and get out of his house. By simply walking out that heavy front door, I successfully kicked the toxic trash out of my life forever. My ruthless corporate attorney finalized the divorce proceedings with breathtaking speed, with his criminal indictment pending and his bank accounts completely empty. Julian eventually stopped contesting the custody terms. I secured full, uncontested legal and physical custody of my precious son. I did not have to pay a single dime of alimony or surrender any fraction of the massive financial empire I built entirely from the ground up. I severed the last remaining legal chain connecting me to that horrible family and legally restored my maiden name, permanently erasing their toxic legacy from my identity. I am no longer the quiet, supportive wife hiding her brilliance to protect a fragile male ego. I am the sole architect of my own destiny. The massive wealth I quietly accumulated was never just about buying luxury items or impressing high society. It was about building an impenetrable fortress of independence. That financial armor gave me the absolute power to stand up calmly in the face of pure hostility and simply walk away without a single second of hesitation. My venture capital firm is currently expanding faster than ever before, and I am completely surrounded by loyal, intelligent colleagues who genuinely celebrate my ongoing success without a single ounce of bitter resentment. I built a beautiful, safe kingdom entirely on my own terms, where no one will ever be able to disrespect me again. I am truly free to live the wonderful, joyful life I have always fully deserved. I look out at the beautiful, peaceful sunset, painting the evening sky in brilliant shades of deep orange and soft purple. I think back to that terrible night when my husband threw a glass of wine on my chest and told me that failures do not belong in his house. He thought he was breaking me, but he had absolutely no idea he was just setting me free. Looking back on the spectacular collapse of my marriage, the greatest lesson I learned was never about revenge. It is about the undeniable power of your own self-worth. Never shrink yourself to protect the fragile ego of a person who fundamentally disrespects you. You do not owe anyone your silence, and you certainly do not have to diminish your own brilliance just to make a weak man feel powerful. The absolute sweetest revenge you can ever achieve is not loud, explosive anger. It is absolute, total financial and emotional independence. It is quietly building your own impenetrable empire and simply walking away, letting your toxic enemies completely burn themselves to the ground with their own unearned arrogance. If you have ever had to step out of a highly toxic relationship or walk away from a family that constantly tried to diminish your bright light, I want to hear from you. Please share your own inspiring experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your true worth and kicking toxicity to the curb. Remember that rebuilding your life entirely on your own terms is the ultimate victory. Thank you so much for watching.